I have climbed the highest mountain, I have run through the fields, only to be here with you, only to be here with you. I have run, I have crawled, I have scaled these city walls, these city walls, only to be here with you. But I still haven't found what I'm looking for. I have kissed honey lips, felt the healing fingertips, it burned like fire, this burning desire. I have smoked with the tongue of angels, I have held hand of the devil, was warm in the night, I'm as cold as a stone, but I still haven't found what I'm looking for. But I still haven't found what I'm looking for. I believe in the kingdom come, when all the colors bleed into one, bleed into one. Yes, I'm still running. You broke the bonds, loose the chains, carry the cross, all of my shame, all of my shame. You know I believe it, but I still haven't found what I'm looking for. But I still haven't found what I'm looking for. But I still haven't found what I'm looking for. But I still haven't found what I'm looking for.
Still haven't found what I'm looking for. So today we go beyond fairness, right? So remember the overall plan of the course. First half will be on another notion of fairness, but then in the second half we actually leave it behind. So the title, Individual Fairness, Privacy and Other Information-Based Harms. So I'd foreshadowed that we'd talk about individual fairness today in the previous lectures. Oh, and the pictures today are from Outback Australia, a place called Ross River, 100 kilometres to the east of Alice Springs. So individual fairness. What we've looked at so far is group fairness. We go and put people into group sensitive attributes, and then we look at statistical ways of judging the fairness of our decision in terms of those groups. What if we took a different starting point? What if we defined our fairness objective to treat similar people similarly? So that's an abstract idea. It does seem like it will sidestep the questions of grouping, right? Because we're just doing it at the individual level. So you think, well, you know, surely this is a straightforward and simple idea. So this, to my knowledge, was proposed first in this paper by Cynthia Dwork. That's the lady pictured in this paper here. So some 11 years ago now. So what's the setup for individual fairness? So I point you to her paper. She uses notation that's a little different to mine. Here I'm just explaining the difference. I'm using X, not V, for the individuals, and Y, not A, for the space of prediction. So you've got to decide what you're going to be consistent with. I'm trying to be consistent with my earlier lectures. And so what we do in this setup is we have to assume that we've got a couple of things. First one is a metric defined on our input space. So X is the feature space, right? The raw, the set of numbers that we measure in our data, and it's a distance. It's literally a metric which measures the similarity of individuals. Like I could do a silly thing like in terms of height, right? I would just measure the difference in height between everyone. Or maybe I'd measure, the number of years of schooling they've had, or all sorts of things, right? But it's directly in terms of the features that we measure. And the smaller the distance, the more similar we think the two individuals are. We use a randomized predictor, so that means given an instance X, we choose the outcome Y according to some distribution M. So we're not going to worry about implementing these things for now. I'm just presenting the way Dworker's theorized this, and she works. This is literally what she does. Assumes that we can think in terms of the distribution of the predictor. We also need another knob, another distance, capital D, which is not necessarily a metric on the space of distributions. We have to be able to say, so here's a predictor that gives a distribution, here's another predictor, gives a different distribution. We need a way of comparing the distributions, right? The logic's going to be, here's two people close in terms of little d. We look at the predictions we make on each of them, and we want them to be similar. Treat similar people similarly. We can then mathematize as I'm about to do just here, right? So we formalize that goal as this Lipschitz constraint, that this has just got a Lipschitz constant 1 essentially. You can just hide the constant in terms of the capital D or D. That basically says that if you have two people that are little d apart, then the predictions that you make on them will be concomitantly close. All right, so the closer X is to X prime, the more stringent is the requirement. The prediction for X and the prediction for X prime are close. That's the idea, right? It's extremely simple. It seems appealing. And it's clearly different to what we had talked about before, right? I mean, there's no sensitive attributes here. There's no independence, right? No conditional independence. It's, looks appealing. And so the more precise goal that they state is essentially, minimize your expected loss subject to this constraint, right? So like with the notion of fairness I introduced in the first lecture, we've already got a learning problem. We already want to predict well. We now, in addition, say we want to predict well and be somehow fair. The thing in green captures that. One key distinction to make between this scheme and the ones that I've talked about so far is that this requires direct access to the X, right, to the features, because that the distance function little d requires that. If capital X, the space of the predictions, is large, and that's often the case for interesting machine learning problems, your feature vectors are big, then there is an enormous number of distances that you should choose. Remember, I've made a big fuss about the knobs that you choose in making your fair prediction. So here, little d is a knob, right? And there's a lot of choices there. And even if, there's lots of functions from x cross x to the positive numbers, just demanding that it's a metric doesn't reduce that set of choices much anyway. And in any case, why make d a metric, right? This is what they did. I'm just presenting what they did. Why does the triangle inequality apply to people? I mean, we're just using some intuition here, right? We started off with the ethical principle, treat similar people similarly. But remember, as I said before, one of the challenges of fair machine learning is you take that abstract ethical principle stated in words, you have to turn it into maths. That's the way they do it. This is a choice. I don't recall seeing any justification in the paper for that. And likewise, how do you choose capital D? That's another knob that you've got to choose, right? And it's even more subtle because perhaps there's some intricate relationship between the two Ds, right? By choosing one D, it somehow might impact how you choose capital D. And in the literature that I've seen, there's no real guidance given to this choice, right? I mean, it's a proposal that says, look, at least this way you can sidestep the issue of choosing groups and sensitive attributes. That seems a plus, right? But on the downside, you've got these things to choose. And there's problems with this. So there's this interesting paper. It's not that long, and for a philosophy paper, it's actually pretty readable, I thought. It's got a funny title, 7 Strictures on Similarity. It's in the readings by Nelson Goodman. And it starts off with this nice quote, similarity. You think similarity is this rather obvious idea. He says, whoa, not so fast. Similarity, I submit, is insidious. It's ever ready to solve philosophical problems and overcome obstacles. It's a pretender, an imposter, a quack. It has its place and uses, but it's more often found where it doesn't belong, professing powers it doesn't possess. Very long-winded way of saying, take care, right? But he elaborates that. This is his opening salvo in his paper. Anyway, interesting to have a look. If that kind of stuff intrigues you, there's a book, I think the library's got a copy, that might also intrigue you. The title alone should grab your attention, Women, Fire and Dangerous Things. What categories reveal about the mind. The title comes from, I might talk about this later in the course, can't remember, but George Lakoff is a linguist. He's referring actually to an Australian Aboriginal tribe, and like in German, you've got these 3 genders. They have 4 categories of words, of different sorts of things, and there is a category, right? So it's not like a gender, there's a category of things, and what are the things in that category? It's this, women, fire, and dangerous things. They lump them all together, right? So he's exploring, well, that's kind of weird, right? Why would you do that? Anyway, it's a pretty interesting book. So we've met group fairness before. Today, I just very quickly introduced you to individual fairness. Let's just think about the relationship between them. The formulation of individual fairness, as I said, appears to sidestep the question of the choice of groups because it hides it in the choice of D. To see this, just think of the following. Every choice of D, the measure of similarity, implies a grouping. All you have to do is use some distance-based clustering algorithm. So you can encode one with the other. The point is, the set of choices you've got for D and the set of choices you've got for groupings, they're both very big, so you can kind of simulate one from the other. And the other way around, if you go and choose some grouping, suppose you're doing group-based fairness, you can choose a D that encodes those particular groups. So I've got a proof here, you can check, I'm not going to walk through. It's just, it all fits on one slide. All I do is I just say, here's a grouping, right? By which I mean a petition. I then go and induce a candidate D from that, and then I just have to check it's a metric. I just check the 3 axioms of being a metric. I find they're satisfied, I'm done, right? So you check that. I'm not saying this is somehow useful. I'm just saying that we've got these 2 candidate schemes, these 2 approaches, group fairness or individual fairness. And you might say, oh, I like group fairness. And your friend might say, I like individual fairness. Here I'm showing, actually, they're not that different after all, right? In both cases, you're encoding the important stuff, like the hard ethical choices, you're encoding it in the knobs each of them have got. You either have to choose the groups or you have to choose the D. So perhaps they're not that different. Anyway, and then I can check, if I choose that particular D induced by a petition, I can ensure satisfaction of the Lipschitz condition by simply choosing my M such that what I've written here. So it's, this is kind of completing the argument, right? So let me stress, this is not necessarily an effective reduction in the sense that every individual fairness problem I could solve with group-based fairness. I'm just saying that there's some overlap here. Understanding the complete relationship between them is kind of beyond me. I don't know of anyone trying to reconcile these 2 approaches beyond what I've presented here. So, and I'm not arguing that the formulation in groups is better. It's just that you've got the choices coded in a different kind of way. I would argue that relative to the proposal we looked at the previous week, the fairness risk measure, I can't see any sensible arguments that you can impose upon the choice of D from ethical grounds, right? So if you might recall, in the fairness risk measure idea, I used this risk measure, this generalized expectation, and there was a stack of axioms that it should satisfy. I gave you arguments, they're not proofs, I gave you arguments as to why you would want it to be monotone, why it would be good to be positively homogeneous, why it would be good to be convex, right? I don't know how to do that here. Maybe you can, but I don't know how to do it. And I do think that one of the complications of this scheme is that we're making the feature values, the x's, directly visible to the fairness module, if you like. So if you recall in a previous lecture, maybe last week, I had a couple of slides on what I called the type signatures of fairness methods, where I was just looking at what types of information does your fairness module have access to. So you can either let it get direct access to the x's, the raw data, or the labels, or maybe the sensitive attributes, or maybe it only gets to see the utilities, the loss function values, right? And I made a point that that was an important distinction to make. Here we see it in action, a difference between individual fairness and, say, my fairness risk measures approach, which also can sidestep the need for groups. The difference is TWORC's individual fairness necessarily has access to the x's, whereas the fairness risk measures doesn't need to. All it ever gets to see is the loss values, right? So that's another distinction. Right, so hopefully you realize that that's a trick question, right? There is no best. And we will return to this in lecture 10 when we look at the choice of groups. There is a little bit of literature, so I contradict myself, I forgot. There is this recent paper by Ruben Binns that has a go at the relationship between individual and group fairness, which I've put as one of the recommended readings, so that might be of interest to you. My recollection is it's not super technical, it's more of just a words paper, but I think it's fairly well written. And one observation he makes is that each notion is inspired by a different moral principle. So this in a way shouldn't surprise us. Like at first sight, it looks kind of annoying that there's all of these different fairness choices. You think, for goodness sake, just tell me which one I should use so I can get on and solve my problem. The point is, as I've already alluded to, different people have different ethical notions, so why would we be surprised that there'll be different, mathematical approaches to this? Yeah, you can read my detailed note there. I'm just qualifying these attempts that people have made that I'm pointing you to. They do tend to rely on a number of assumptions that I will be criticizing and arguing against in a few later lectures. So that's all I'm flagging. I point you to this to see what the state of the art is, but I'm not saying that these folks have nailed it. One part of the analysis that these folks gave was an appeal to an ethical principle that's got this fancy name, luck egalitarianism. What that means, as far as I can understand it, is that there's a difference between holding you responsible for things under your control versus things not under your control. So at first sight, this looks like it's kind of straightforward, right? So you can't control your sex, or at least without major interventional surgery, right? Let's suppose if we ignore that, sex is something that you're born with, or race, right? And so the argument goes that it's particularly invidious to discriminate against people on things that they can't control. Whereas, let's say the amount of homework you do in a course, well, it was your choice to do that, right? And so it's less of a problem if we discriminate that way. So one interesting line of argument, just to make you confused about the issue, in case I haven't made you confused enough already, is people say, okay, fine, you take that like egalitarianism idea, and then you go and think about conscientiousness, right? So this thing about how much homework you choose to do. Sure, I can discriminate upon that. But here's the thing. Who are the people that do lots of homework reliably and consistently? They're the conscientious people. Whereas the people that don't do that, they're not very conscientious. And it turns out, psychologically, conscientiousness ends up being one of these things that you're born with. So if you're not doing your homework and you're getting bad grades, it's actually your parents' fault, right? But you see why these arguments at that level are so slippery, right? It seemed like it was kind of clear. Oh yeah, sex and race, sure, you're born with that. They're a no-go. But this thing where, you know, hey, you chose to go to the pub instead of studying, well, actually it's part of your makeup, right? Just because you're sitting in the front row doesn't fool me at all, right? Anyway, so all of that's kind of tricky, and a lot of the literature about individual fairness touches upon these considerations, and like the complexity just explodes. And I don't think I've got any more wisdom than take great care, right? I make the point here. These arguments at first sight are appealing, but it means that we couldn't rely on psychology about people anymore, which, I don't know, seems problematic. So why would you even bother with individual fairness, right? Well, as Dwork et al. Show in the paper where they introduced it, they have a separate argument that connects it to the group-based fairness. With a particular choice of capital D, it reduces, you can relate it directly to demographic parity. There's the specific thing, you take a particular distance between distributions, a thing called the Earth mover distance. It doesn't matter what that is, it's just a particular choice. And in that case, they show that if you get a good level of individual fairness, then you will get a good level of statistical parity, right? So they're kind of capturing the same thing. It's not exact. Another reason why bother with individual fairness is simply to show that there's actually another completely different approach to this, right? The approach we started with in lecture 1, where we said there are these sensitive attributes, that's a very natural starting point, and a lot of the literature starts there. It's interesting that you can start in a different place. But also I wanted to stress this point about the degrees of freedom that you've got, right? The number, you know, the dimensionality of the knobs that you've got. So you have this scheme, let's say, this principle of how to impose fairness on your machine learning problem, but now the devil's in the detail. You've actually got to go and choose this distance. Different choices will result in completely different answers, and somehow you've got to justify that. And then the final point is that it turns out that it's quite closely related to something else Cynthia Dwork developed, which is differential privacy, which is what we will now look at. So, moving on from fairness, privacy and machine learning in particular, we start with this thing called differential privacy. So, in the title of the lecture, I use this phrase, an information-based harm. So, you can say that privacy and fairness are both information-based harms in the sense that you can be harmed because of information about you that potentially is used as the basis of an action to your detriment. Now, there are some privacy harms that don't necessarily have action involved. So there's some philosophers talk about a harm of dignity. So if I know something about you, I don't tell anyone, but I know it, that you are embarrassed about, right? So somehow your dignity suffers from that. So, you know, there is a harm going on there even though I'm not acting, like even if I don't do anything with it. In other cases, I might know something about you and then harm you in the sense that I don't give you a job, right? So we distinguish between those two notions. Anyway, we've got fairness, we have privacy, but there's a range of privacy harms with the same characteristic. Information about you can cause harm, but they're different harms to that caused by a lack of fairness. And what I'll be leading up to is there are harms that might go under the general banner of privacy, that are beyond these ones of secret information, that you're harmed just by someone knowing something about you. The harm is very much to do with the action that's taken. I'll make that clear shortly. And if we examine what existing methods for ensuring privacy do and what they don't do, I argue that that's going to provide us with some broader insights into this complicated question relating data, machine learning methods, and society. So, the key innovation that Cynthia Dwork had in the invention of differential privacy was that she reduced it to a machine learning problem. So this was pretty cool. People have been thinking about privacy for 100 years, privacy to do with data for decades beforehand, but what she turned it into a learning problem, which I'm about to show you. So recall, one view of fairness we had the peculiar interpretation that we try to solve a particular learning problem, that is learning the sensitive attributes from X as badly as possible, right? So that was in my cost of fairness paper. This, once we set things up, we realized that's what we were trying to do. We wanted to be able to predict the why, the thing that we're interested in, very well from the data, but at the same time, we wanted to ensure that we could not predict the sensitive attribute, right? So being fair corresponded to doing a necessarily lousy job on a particular learning problem. So my point is that not only are we taking a standard learning problem and imposing a fairness constraint, the particular way we looked at the fairness constraint, it was a learning problem in its own right, but one which we wanted to do as poorly as possible. Anyway, differential privacy is an approach to privacy for data analysis that also connects the ethical goal, privacy, to a statistical decision problem. And it's a big deal now. So there's a lot of literature on it. There's multiple books. I thought I'd do a search. This is baffling. I know you can't read it here, but you can see it on the slides. This is inexplicable that there is a book on big data and differential privacy for railroad track engineering. You can check it, you can Google it, right? It exists. I don't have a copy, but if you want to buy it, it's 130 euros. It looks like a load of rubbish, frankly, but who knew? Anyway, so differential privacy, it's not niche, it's a big deal, right? Lots of the big tech companies make a big deal about it. They say that they implement it. And it's got a trade-off between utility and privacy, which is rather analogous to the trade-off between utility and fairness. And the trade-off is controlled by mechanisms. So if you go and look this up, you'll see that they have these particular mechanisms. A mechanism here ends up just being adding a certain sort of noise. You obfuscate the data in such a way to achieve the privacy requirement. So on this single slide, I'm just going to give the formal setup, just so that I can show you, I can justify my claim that you reduce it to a learning problem. So you say you've got some data about people, like a big feature vector, and you have some relationship. So it's kind of like the distance measure we had before. I'm just sticking with the notation that's used in the differential privacy literature. So this is the relation that if we go x twiddle x prime, that simply means that they are close, right? We have some output set y. We have some mechanism, which is just a randomization described in terms of its distribution. Remember, when I write delta of y, I mean the set of probability distributions on y. So when I say a randomized mechanism and I give the distribution, I mean that the mechanism takes that distribution and then generates something at random from that distribution. And then this is the definition, the simple definition. We say that our mechanism, right, so that's the thing that we're doing. We're going to mess with the data a little bit. We say that it's epsilon differentially private if for all x that are similar to x prime and all events e, this condition on the right holds, right? And you see what this is saying is that the probability that your predictor mx is in some set e on the left, and on the right hand side we've got the probability that mx prime is in e. So I'm comparing two probabilities, the probability of the output of my mechanism on x and x prime, respectively, living in some arbitrary set E, and I demand they're close. In this sense, right, where I say that one probability must be less than or equal to some factor times the other. And we see here we have an epsilon. Epsilon is something we want to be small, and I've got an E, just the base of the natural logarithm, E to the epsilon. If epsilon is small, right, this is a number close to 1, right? So this is just a constraint, which basically says that the probability on the left can't be much bigger than some constant factor, the probability on the right. The logic behind this is that it makes it hard to tell in terms of the output of your predictor. It's hard to tell whether we had x or x prime. The logic behind all of this is that they want to be able to say, we get the data for everyone, we mess with it a little bit, such that it's impossible to tell whether your data is in the data set or not, right? That's the logic. And the reasoning is that if it's statistically impossible to tell whether you're in the data set or not, that gives you some privacy guarantee. That's their logic. Now, you can argue with whether that's what you want. We'll get to that in a sec. And then they've got another version with an additive constant here. So it's really this fancier version with the delta. It's just that you add this extra delta here. All right. So it's just different ways of controlling the difference between those two probabilities. And yeah, in a single sentence, this is the idea, that your mechanism is random enough to destroy most of the private information while still leaving something in the data one can learn from. That's what you're doing. That's the logic of this. You take your data, the raw data that's got all of the sensitive stuff, you degrade it a little bit so that it becomes near impossible to tell whether or not you're in the data set or not. And the logic is that that is your privacy guarantee. Right, so that's what I just said. So it turns the question of privacy into a statistical decision problem. Let me say it another time. This is a particular choice, a particular formalization of privacy, right? I am not making the claim that the nebulous notion that you have of privacy, I've just given a mathematization of it. No, it's an approach that the proponents have argued this captures something of what we want to do with privacy when we're doing data analytics. And it's something that we can mathematize and we can actually go and implement. So that's a plus, yep.
So what's the benefit of using the epsilon theta differential privacy instead of just epsilon?
Oh, it's just that you can get better results. So the idea is that you want to be able to come up with a mechanism, right? You say the mechanism is the choice M, right? And it comes down to what you can actually prove about it. It's just, if you could live without it, that would be great. But sometimes you just can't, right? The simple version, so you do have, actually I realize, this is slightly incorrect, right? I should have just said epsilon I differentially private here. So if you have two mechanisms that are epsilon I differentially private, then when you go and look at them jointly, then you end up with that the overall thing is epsilon 1 plus epsilon 2 differentially private. Look, I don't want to go into great detail on this. There is a big literature on it. It's attractive, like it allows you to prove theorems about these mechanisms. And so lots of people were excited when this got invented that, rather than just saying, oh, we make it private by not releasing any information, right? And this is being used, the latest US census, they use this to try and restrict access to the raw data, right? So just as an aside, I should have had this on the slide, but so suppose we do a census of the whole country. I've got all sorts of secret information about everyone, right? But it's done by the government, who you trust, you've got no choice, and they keep that all secure in a database and don't let anyone to have access to the raw data. But what they do is they allow people to ask questions like, how many people under the age of 25 live in this suburb? And so on like that. Now, depending upon the granularity of the questions that you can answer, there's been lots of examples where people can zero in on an individual. You just have to ask a handful of broad brush questions in an intersectional way, and we can zero in, right? I guess your age, I guess your ethnicity, I guess some other thing about you, right? I ask a bunch of these broad questions, and then I start intersecting, and I can actually zero in on your attributes. So this is one of the reasons why it's used. And so it'd be easy. I know there's a paper by the guy who was in charge of privacy for the US Census. I saw him give a talk at a machine learning conference about this. Anyway, this is still warm up for us, right? This is not an end point. I'm just using it to motivate what comes next by virtue of what this fails to do. So I'm not really selling what it does do that much because I want to focus on its failings. Before we get there, a way that I find more insightful, I guess it always depends upon your background, right? Nan would know if I can reduce something to a question about F divergences, I'm going to go and do it. And indeed, it turns out, so Flavio Depin-Calmon at Harvard worked this out. So in the non-lecture, hopefully some of you looked at, there's this idea of an F divergence. It's a way of measuring a distance between distributions. It's parameterized by function F. If you choose a particular F, like this, which is just a piecewise linear function, and then go and define this thing, so they call it E sub lambda. It's just IF of lambda between two distributions. And it's very much like the variational divergence with a tilt. If lambda equals 1, it is the variational divergence, essentially. Anyway, it turns out, you look at that line in yellow in the middle, is the crucial thing. What this says is that claiming that M is epsilon delta differentially private is the same as saying a particular divergence between the outputs of the two mechanisms, between the output of the mechanisms on the two data points is small, right? And the epsilon ends up inside the choice of the divergence measure, and then the delta is the bound. Now, to me, I mean, since I'm kind of comfortable with these divergences, I like this one a lot better, but it's equivalent. The interesting takeaway is that it's just information theoretic, right? So it's like, remember, I first introduced this exact fairness, and then I showed you how to generalize that, and in terms of mutual information, which is essentially a divergence between two distributions, it's a similar thing here. So the high level takeaway is that in the same way that fairness can be stated as an information theoretical constraint, this shows likewise differential privacy can be. There's another interpretation, like if you've done classical statistics, you might like this one better, due to Larry Wasserman. It's just a statistical hypothesis test. So this was published, 2010, Journal of the American Statistical Association, right? I'm not saying you try and read that, I just wanted to flag there's multiple ways of looking at this. Anyway, what's my takeaway? The imposition of a privacy constraint in this fashion can be understood as imposing a limit on a measure of information. So what do I conclude about differential privacy?
Question.
Yep.
Could you just please go to the previous slide?
Yep.
If you use the same example as before, when
Yep.
you're talking about like a population, and then if you
Yep.
ask certain questions, you can get an individual's
Yep.
information. So if you take the hypothesis test, like what would a good null hypothesis be for this?
The hypothesis test is that, so we essentially, the motivating example would be we look at the distribution we get, say this is our population, I get data on everyone, and then I compare it to data on everyone except you, right? And then I want to go and see, I want to be able to test, can I reliably detect, can I see a difference? Can I detect whether you're in the data set or not?
So like a good null hypothesis would be that it's impossible
Yes.
to get an individual's information
That's right.
from a distribution.
That's right. I can't tell whether you're in there or not. So you've got deniability, right? That's the logic. Right. So it's super popular. It's built on notions of information. But in terms of that general ethical word, privacy, right? The thing I want to stress now to move away, to look at a larger agenda, is that it's looking at privacy as secrecy. So what I'm leading up to is an interesting alternative to that. Privacy need not be construed just as secrecy. And exploring alternative notions will lead us to some deeper insights I think, into the role and effect of data on people. So, we now move on from privacy as secrecy to privacy as autonomy, motivating why we need to look at a broader perspective. So what can't differential privacy do? So this is like if you are keen and you want to find the Bible on differential privacy, there's this like a 300-page paper that spells all of that out. I'm just quoting a little bit from the introduction. So it tells you, just in different words to what I've said before. So you can go and read these. I'm not going to go and read all of them, about what it can do. They observed that, if you like the example I gave is that you're a smoker, and suppose you weren't even included in some study to do with the effects of smoking. I've still learned some information about you, right? I study all of these people who are smokers. You're also a smoker. You weren't included in the study, but indirectly I've learned something about you, right? So that idea can't be captured by differential privacy. And they elaborate on this. Differential privacy promises to protect individuals from any additional harm they might face due to their data being in the private database that they would not have faced had their data not been part of it. It's not guaranteeing that you don't get any harm. It's just guaranteeing it's mitigating the additional harm that, we did the survey of all smokers, your data's not in it. I work out some intervention on smokers that may well harm you. And then we look at the difference in harm that would accrue to you had your data been in there. That's what it protects. So it's not necessarily the thing that you're after. And they go on to say, it's quite possible that we could derive all sorts of interesting statistical conclusions about you, even though your data was not in there. All right, I'll let you read their full words. So, what might motivate us to think about privacy differently? So here I'm going to propose a business model. So you've all heard of software as a service. You know the idea of that? Right, so here's a new business model I'm proposing. I reckon I could get pretty rich with this. It's called manipulation as a service. So the idea is, first I form a company. The company collects data on lots of people. And it's got rock solid data security practices. Your data's in a bunker under a mountain. They've got the best IT guys. Your personal information will not leak. And nobody or no organization will be told any personal information about you. It's locked down tight. That collected data in the bunker is used to build a statistical model. And then an API is offered to that model to the highest bidder. The bidder does not get the raw data. They don't even get the statistical model. They just get an API to use the statistical model. The API allows the anonymous third party to direct messages to a subset of people in the database. That's what the API offers, right? Send this message to all the people that like cats that are between 30 and 35 years old, right? It can do that. They don't need to know who that is, right? They just need the message to go and get there. The third party's got no way of knowing who those people are, and they don't even care. They just want the message to get there. The messages are very effective because they're targeted so precisely, and consequently, the people who receive these messages will have their thoughts modified. These are effective messages. Cat owners between the ages of 30 and 35 want to buy cat insurance or something or other. Or, there used to be this thing in the US where you could clone your cat, right? So I'm serious, right? They offered this service, cost you several $1,000s. Like if you really like your cat, you get a backup cat. I'm not kidding. But you, the subject, are unaware of this manipulation. You're just receiving messages. Cat cloning, awesome. From your perspective, you made up your own mind on the basis of all sorts of stuff that you read, which you thought you stumbled across of your own accord. In your mind, you're still the master of your own destiny and actions. The third party's delighted because you behave the way they want. Maybe they wanted you to vote for a certain candidate. The original company profits handsomely because the access to the API is monetized, right? They collect money. And it's basically an API that manipulates you. And I reiterate, all this can be done and is done while achieving the highest possible levels of privacy. I can coat this whole thing in differential privacy, no problem at all, right? Doesn't interfere with it in the slightest. And the only ethical harms that many perceive is that the manipulation is not equally fair to everyone or leads to differential outcomes according to the membership of certain groups. So maybe female cat owners between ages 30 and 35 are slightly more susceptible than male cat owners. And you could worry about that, right? But that wouldn't get in the way of the third party. Right, anyway, it's just hypothetical, right? Of course, it's not hypothetical, right? This is the business model of companies like Facebook and Google. That's precisely the model of computational advertising. And it's not that it's computational, it's that it's advertising that's using information about people to manipulate them. So here's a non-computational example that hopefully makes you squirm in your seat a little bit. So suppose you want to sell products to women to make them look pretty. I don't know, makeup or something or other. When should you send the ads to them? Turns out Monday morning, right? There you go. Can't say you don't learn anything useful at university. There's the fact, right? So you think, oh, really? And it's like, okay, knowing that, you kind of wish you didn't know it. But the point is that there's a business that's built around getting such insights and then using them, right? I think the logic is that, maybe women who care about the way they look care more about it on a Monday after the weekend, whatever, right? The point is you're using information about a population to target messages to individuals in the hope of changing their behavior. That's my model, manipulation as a service. So the funny thing is, if you have that in mind and then you go and look at, when people go and look at, let's worry about the ethical harms, privacy, fairness, etc. of computational advertising. There are papers on this. Like here's one, privacy preserving targeted advertising. Right? So they say, targeted advertising, it's a thing. Oh, but we've got to worry about, ethical concerns. We've got to go and make it fair and so on. And anyway, it's that's what they propose to do. I don't think it's that unfair to make the analogy to say that the problem with landmines is that they're not equally lethal to people of a different shape, right? It's like you're doing this harm, but you want to achieve it uniformly, right? To me, it's a classic example that you're solving the wrong problem. So how can this happen? And why do we not perceive it as a privacy violation? And what might we do about it, right? So that's what's next on the agenda. And this, I want to just stress, we're talking about these practices mediated via computers, data, and machine learning, but the idea is not new. So this is Calvin Coolidge, former president of the US, speaking nearly 100 years ago about the power of advertising. And even this idea of trawling through lots of data in order to be able to do this better, that is not new either. 1926, this publishing company, they conducted a dry waste survey. You know what that means? They sent out people into the neighbourhood where people had thrown out rubbish, and they dug through their rubbish bins to see what they'd thrown out, right? It's a way of getting information about people, right? Because you could know what they've read by reading the stuff in the rubbish bin. It's data exhaust. It's like following your clickstream, right? I think the analogy's pretty good. Anyway, the point is, these things are not new, they're just made more powerful by virtue of computers. And how much more powerful are they? So, you all need to know of this stupendously ill-advised piece of work that Facebook did, I guess, nearly 10 years ago now. Experimental evidence of massive scale emotional contagion through social networks. Has anyone heard of this? So the geniuses in Facebook thought, why don't we do an experiment to see if we can manipulate people's emotional state just by changing what shows up in their newsfeed. So they just took a tranche of the Facebook users and they just deliberately manipulated it to send positive or negative valence messages. And then they looked at what the people posted, right? So if you were in the treatment group, they would send you more, they would filter the news items that you saw to be more negative, and they were proud that they managed to make you sad. Big effect size. Good data. Yeah, really. There was a shitstorm afterwards, as you can well imagine. And, you know, there's some nice literature about that. But the interesting thing is that, you know, so they got hammered about this for I think for fine reason. But, you know, there's this, this was one of their responses, I guess, from, I don't know, some corporate communications person in Facebook. They say, oh, look, it was just done for a single week. None of the data was associated with a specific person. And we carefully, you know, we thought about it really carefully. And we didn't collect any data unnecessarily. So, and it's all secure, right? Sounds good, right? No privacy violation. What are you worried about? So my point here is it's a bait and switch, right? Yes, they ensured privacy is secrecy very well. Absolutely they did. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that they were deliberately manipulating people to make them sad just for yucks. Anyway, that was a scientific experiment, right? I mean, you might think they're not actually going to do this stuff, right? You know, they wouldn't do this for real. This old ex-KCD cartoon, I don't know if you can read that, where he says, you know, the time traveler from 2021 comes back to 1991. Says, so what's happened? Well, there's a federal law to combat laser attacks on airliners. There's TV shows where robots battle. Cordless phones have a longer range, and it's really easy to send news stories to your friends. Wow, okay. Now guess which of these turns out to be the most important? It's not the lasers. Right? So Joaquin Quinero Candela, I know quite well. He was the machine learning engineer in Facebook that made the Facebook platform work so well as it does, right? That basically deployed machine learning at a large scale to achieve the benefits and the incredible revenue growth that Facebook had. And there's this fantastic article in the readings, I think it was in Wired magazine, that, you know, where they have this long interview with Joaquin about this, because eventually they realized actually this causes all sorts of problems. You know, you can manipulate elections and so on. So it becomes a real problem, right? And the question is, you know, how big an issue is this? And so just before the break, I just need to clarify. I now show you something. Sometimes we're scientists, but we can learn from artists. So what I'm about to show you is the work of an artist.
Imagine this for a second. One man with total control of billions of people's stolen data, all their secrets, their lives, their futures. I owe it all to Spectre. Spectre showed me that whoever controls the data controls the future.
Go Mark. I don't think he actually said that, although I can't prove that he didn't, right? That is a fake video, but it's kind of fun. We have a break.
Well, I remember when I was young, the world had just begun and I was happy. I used to wonder about the earth and how it moved around the sun so snappy. Imagination going wild makes a very backward child, they told me. So back at school I'd sit around waiting for the sound so I could go on home. My mama, she was cool. Sometimes I think about it, it happens every day. I should think of the present, 'cause the present's now. I remember when I was young, wanting trippins got you in the movies. To look tough, we'd light a smoke and very nearly choke, but we had a real good time. Growing old and makes you dead to fly a saber jet and fight a few wars. I just sit there all day and let my mind decay. Something awful. Sometimes I think about it. You know what happens every day. I should think of the present, 'cause the present's now. Well, I remember when I was young, I had a secret love who never knew it. I'd do tricks upon my bike, they'd never turn out right. I always blew it. And the day we had to part, I had a broken heart, but I couldn't let on. So I spent my holidays thinking about the ways I must have gone wrong. Sometimes I think about it. You know what happens every day. I should think of the present, 'cause the present's now. Sometimes I think about it. You know what happens every day. I should think of the present, 'cause the present's now. I remember when I was young, the Beatles turned me on, they really blew my mind. And with Terry, Jack and Pam, we'd go and watch a band and have a real good time. Then I heard the Black Man's Blues, it really blew a fuse inside my head. So with some friends we made a stand, formed our first blues band. It was a real good thing. Sometimes I think about it. You know what happens every day. I should think of the present, 'cause the present's now. I remember when I was young. I remember when I was young, I surely do. I hope you all do too.
The tutors said that you liked the music, so I'm inflicting the music on you. Well, it's different each week. This is the night sky in Australia, the Milky Way. In case you've ever seen the local neighbourhood, astronomical neighbourhood, you can't see it from the Northern Hemisphere. All right, we carry on. So I've motivated, there's an interesting question here, that information-based harm mediated by machine learning technology, but it's certainly not captured by notions of fairness. So the question we now ask is, how should we go about thinking about this idea of privacy as autonomy? You know, what might you do about it? Can you mitigate it in a technological way? And just as a build up to that, it's curious and kind of surprising that this is something that, let's say it's hidden in plain sight. So this lady, Ricky Jorgensen, wrote this paper, What Platforms Mean When They Talk About Human Rights. So human rights is an even broader frame to put things in. Anyway, she says this, she did this field work where she went and spoke to machine learning engineers working in companies that use the technology, and she says that none of the people I spoke to associate the company's dedication to privacy with limits on the information that's collected about its users. Data collection and targeted advertising is the taken for granted context in the sense that it's a premise for using the service. Like, it's not seen as a problem. It's like, of course we're going to go and do this. Yes, we keep the data secure, right? So no one can steal the raw data. But of course we're going to use the data to, send targeted messages and sell that because, well, that's just what's done, isn't it? There's nothing wrong with doing that. So it turns out philosophers, I guess, have been thinking about this kind of harm for some time. So Gerald Dworkin's a philosopher, said this is a book from 1988, The Theory and Practice of Autonomy. And he made this nice point. One way of interfering with your autonomy is to deceive you. This interference with information, however, is just the opposite kind from that involved in interference in privacy. What is controlled is the information coming to you, not the information coming from you. So if I go and learn that, secretly, I don't know, you have some terrible personal habit that you're embarrassed about, that's information coming from you, right? Whereas if I can engineer things that I can send you messages that change your behavior, maybe without you even realizing it, it's completely opposite, right? So it's information coming from versus information going to. So let's try and schematize that. Like, let's try and draw a diagram of it. So here's you, right? An individual, particular person. But there's lots of you. You're a member of a society, right? There's many people. And here's some faceless company, right? Lives in a big building, and they get some data about you, right? Could be all sorts of things, right? Your web browsing behavior or anything. But they don't just get your information, they get everyone's information. And what do they do with that? They keep it very secret, but they run a machine learning algorithm. There it goes, and it's converged. And poof, you get a statistical model, right? That's what you can do with all of that data. And then what do? This is my business model I described before. They sell an access to that model to a third party. Here's the third party in red. And that third party can, via the API that uses that statistical model, get the original corporation to send a message on their behalf to you. Now, the red company doesn't know who you are. I stress this, right? Your privacy, in terms of them knowing that this is, James Smith here, they can't know, right? This is just bulletproof. But the point is, they're accessing the statistical model and then they're querying that statistical model and using that to send the message to you. But they don't just want to do that for the sake of informing you. They're trying to do that to get you to change your behavior, right? To move. You've changed your position. They've persuaded you. Instead of voting for this person, you vote for that person. Instead of buying this kind of pair of shoes, you buy this other kind of pair of shoes. That's the whole point. That's the business model, right? That's why it's worth money. So that's the model. So let's just think of the information flow. So I've stressed the information theoretic viewpoint. I mean, I think it's a good abstract way of thinking of these problems. I've already shown you can use it to think about notions of fairness. Ditto with the differential privacy. So we think in terms of information. So information is essentially what's flowing on these wires. And how might we mitigate this, right? So this scenario works because of the whole thing, right? You get the information from the person, you build the statistical model, you have the third party access that, and then they send the message to you. So we could break this by breaking any one of the wires. We can break the green wire by not providing any information. Okay, that might be problematic, but you could do it. You don't use the service, they can't build a model about you. Or you could provide noisy information. And I'll give you an example of that in a second, right? Because that's the thing, once you start thinking information theoretically, it's not just that there's some information, it's whether it's accurate, right? If I could always tell them something that was wrong, they're going to build a lousy model of me, and thus I won't be as easy manipulable. I could cut the orange wire by not reading the information they send you. So if you know if there's a clear-cut distinction between, let's say, advertisement and non-advertisement, and you can just filter out the advertisements, again, this can't work. You only need to break one wire for this to not work. But there's more subtle ones. I can interfere with the red wire, doing economic damage to this business relationship by programmatically interfering with it. So for example, if the red company pays blue company on a pay-per-click basis, then Jane Smith can just get her web browser to click on every ad automatically. Right? That's going to interfere with this. And in principle, you could regulate the orange wire and treat it as a media company. So those proposals, some of those proposals, you can implement them, right? They're available right now as browser plugins. So Track Me Not is a browser plugin that interferes with the green wire, the information about you. So now imagine instead of it's a Facebook, it's a Google. So every minute or so, your web browser fires off a random Google query, right? Just based on some statistical model that the people that have built this have made. So in a day you might make 10 actual queries about things that you're interested in, but it's hidden in 300 other queries that completely hide what you're doing. You've buried the signal in noise, right? So that's something that you could do. My computer's been running that for years, right? Too bad for the Google. The more interesting one is Ad Nauseam, which interferes with it's a great title, isn't it, right? That interferes with the economics of the red wire by, so you can have this technology of ad blocking, so we detect whether it's an ad or not. So one version is that you just don't show the advertisement on your screen. What this does, it does that, so you don't actually get to see it, but then behind the scenes, without any effort from you, it clicks on every ad, right? So every ad that anyone's ever tried to show me, my computer has gone and clicked on it without me having to do anything. And the beautiful thing is it keeps track of that, how many ads that you clicked upon, and it has an economic model of the economic damage that you've inflicted on the pay-per-click advertising ecosystem, and I'm up to $6,800 US. It's cool, huh? Yeah, so there's this nice paper about that, surveillance countermeasures expressive privacy via obfuscation. The point is, this whole thing runs with information, right? So you just have to start thinking, how can I mess with the information, right? You don't have to just cut the wire. You can feed in false information and you've still inflicted damage upon it as a way of trying to protect you. The interesting thing is the differential privacy mechanisms that I described, they inject noise also. Injecting noise is equal to destroying information, right? Both doing the same thing. Differential privacy is lauded by these tech companies. I don't know why, but if you run the Chrome browser, you're not actually allowed to install Ad Nauseam. I mean, why would Google mind, right? It's actually a clue that it must work, right? But you can install it on other browsers. There's also non-technical mitigations to this that we'll come to in some later lectures. So I briefly mentioned this regulation, right? Government regulation. So we'll talk about this later when we think about, should you actually regulate technologies or should you regulate the use of the technologies? This ecosystem is kind of interesting. Like, we can view it as just information flows. We can go and describe it as, oh, it's the search business. Oh, it's the social media business. You could go and say, oh, it's the media business. Media in most Western countries is regulated. Like, you don't want to go and let, one person, like some short Italian guy, own all of the TV stations in a country, right? Most countries want to protect that, and you can't do it. But these systems, the ones that are mediated via machine learning, are not categorized that way, so they're not regulated in that way. There's self-action that you can do. So I think this is interesting for us to think about. Here you are learning about machine learning, but you're also data points for these algorithms, right? So think about data hygiene for your computer. So you didn't grow up in the era where there was autoexec.bat. You stick a memory stick in the computer and it just executes whatever on it. You don't just download an executable onto your computer and run it, right? It's information hygiene. Do you practice information hygiene for yourself? Do you think that because you're conscious of yourself that you can read anything that comes across your desk and you won't be manipulated by it? No, right? Well, you shouldn't, right? So that's my point, right? You want to be careful about what you read because you can't tell where it's come from. You don't know who's trying to play you. It looks just like a string of bits, but you have to think of the entire chain of provenance of where it's come from. So as a personal approach, you can approach all your information ingestion like a scientist and demand its provenance. Like, it's one thing to say, this causes that. You just read that on a piece of paper you found on the street. If you see a paper on the Nature website, right, you give it a lot more credence. So as a scientist, you always pay attention to the provenance of information. In our day-to-day lives, we just don't. Or you could avoid exposure, right? I mean, we're all used to these masks that we used to wear. I found some really cool ones, right? Turns out that you can make this as a fashion thing. This was my favorite one, right? So I found this a couple of years ago and they were predicting that, in a couple of years' time, everyone's going to be wearing one of them. But just keep that image in mind and think about, instead of ingesting germs, you're ingesting toxic information. Anyway, so what am I trying to achieve here? Hopefully I've made the point that it's not just a technical problem. It doesn't just involve you. It involves other individuals. The reason why this model, this whole system works, right? The sneaky thing about it is that it's not just information about you, it's information about everyone, right? And once you have enough information about everyone, we can actually target information to you extremely well. We've learned about you by learning about others and then relying upon the fact that in many ways you're similar to them, right? That's the sneaky thing. So you can't ignore the dynamics, that kind of social dynamics, if you want to, solve this, mitigate this, control it in some kind of way. So that's kind of part of my argument. So how do we think about this, right? So there's a couple of authorities that we can appeal to here. I've already alluded to this. I'm now just making the terminology a little more precise. We can distinguish between privacy as secrecy, so someone gets hold of information about you and the mere possession of it causes you harm, or privacy as autonomy, which is information flows interfere with your autonomy and self-determination. So this is the taking information from you or sending information to you. And to understand the latter, distinguish between persuasion, right? So we use the word persuasion to be, so here I'm trying to persuade you, right? I'm a third party trying to convince you of something, but it's manifest to you that I'm trying to persuade you, right? The whole situation, I'm the lecturer, you're paying attention, you're not necessarily believing everything I say, you're looking at it skeptically, you know that you're being persuaded, right? Or the other one, right, our other expert here, I'll let her speak for herself.
I genuinely love the process of manipulating people online for money.
Right, so she's an expert at it. Again, this is an artwork. I don't think she actually said that. Maybe she did, right? So someone synthesized this video. You can go and look. There was this kind of installation. It's a clever title, Big Data, instead of Big Data, right? So there was this exhibition of these, what are they called, deepfake videos with a pointed purpose. Anyway, so Kim Kardashian and Mark Zuckerberg and a couple of other people starred in it. Anyway, the distinction I'm making is between persuasion and manipulation. And I think it's a very interesting distinction to make because, you can have the same information, like the same message, but the way it's delivered it may not be clear to you whether you're being persuaded or manipulated. So in the, I'll give you a way of thinking about that in a sec. Now, why is this hard, right? So I've tried to make the distinction, but why is it an important distinction? So there's this paper from, I think from the 1970s by this fellow, Russell Harden, Ethics and Stochastic Processes. And, you know, in all of the reading that I've done for this course, this was one of the standout articles where I thought, oh gosh, this is, he's actually got something really quite interestingly different to say. And the critical thing that he's looking at is that, you know, if I want to go and say manipulate people, manipulation, it feels very much like, you know, I'm picking up this thing, you know, I pick up this chair, I manipulate it, and I move it over there. It's like this direct, causal, deterministic action. The example that I gave before, you know, with my cartoon diagram, the manipulation can be stochastic. It doesn't matter if, you know, suppose I want to try and manipulate all of you. I'm the advertiser. I send the message out. 80% of you change your behavior on the basis of the message. I don't know which 80%. I'm still very happy, right? There's a stochastic element to that. I don't have to have deterministic control. So Harden, in this paper, which I've put as one of the recommended readings, he grapples with this problem with a very apposite example in our times, which is to do with a vaccine. So he sets up this problem. He says, suppose that there's this disease, there's a vaccine, it's highly effective, right? It fixes almost everyone, but there's a very small chance that some people will suffer an adverse reaction to the vaccine. They might even die, but it's a very small fraction. And then he's grappling with the moral issue behind that, right? Whether as a group, you should go and do this. And he identifies a key part of what makes that problem tricky to think about is the stochastic nature, right? If you knew who was going to be harmed by the vaccine, it's easy peasy. You just don't give it to them. The hard bit is you don't know. So you're reasoning, you're doing this thing where you're reasoning in terms of the aggregate, but you can't work out exactly what the effect is on the individual. So I think that that's very relevant for us in trying to understand the effect of these machine learning systems which work with aggregates, but whose harm is inflicted upon individuals. Right? That's my key point. Yep, so vaccination, I think it's a good read. And, so the other thing then to keep in mind is, you know, one of Kant's formulations of his categorical imperative is that human beings should be treated as ends, not as mere means to an end for other people. So if you take that as your ethical precept, remember I've flagged that when we're looking at the different notions of fairness, there's different ethical starting points that we can take, and then we can go and mathematize them and turn them into some concrete thing. If you take this as one of your starting points, which has got this famous lineage, then that whole business model of the computational advertising seems really quite flawed, right? I mean, I don't see how you can fix it. Like if you take that as your principle and you think that, oh, well, can I go and tweak the system to respect the individual in this fashion? The only thing you could do is to turn it off. So I think there's an interesting tension there. Yes, so that's what I said. Violations of privacy or autonomy seem to me to be precisely the use of humans as means, violating Kant's principle. So it's not independence or secrecy, but it's what is done to whom, by whom. So there's quite a bit of literature. I mean, I had to dig deep to find this, but it turns out that this idea of thinking of privacy as autonomy instead of secrecy actually goes back a long way. So this is going back 40 years. You can see the quotes here by this fellow. I think he was a legal scholar. I think maybe both of these were legal scholars, where they're trying to get to the essence of privacy. There's a long history in the courts about privacy. Corporations trying to do certain things, people go and complain about privacy, there's laws about privacy. So the exact meaning of these things has been debated for a long time. All I've done here is to find a couple of pointers to literature zeroing in on this notion of privacy as autonomy. So here's the surprising thing. It has been theorized for a long time. It is very widely used. This business model is pervasive, but it's hardly talked about in policy discussions about digital privacy, right? So you'll see, there's this incredible bait and switch done, right? So the computational advertising companies did this very clever move where they said, oh yeah, we respect privacy, and that's what's behind the fact that you have to accept cookies on every single site you go to, right? Have you ever noticed this? We respect your privacy. Do you want to accept the cookie? And everyone's like, whatever, right? It's just a giant bait and switch that it doesn't solve any problem at all. It just distracts you from the problem that you're interested in. And the usual notions, so that's one problem. Another interesting problem. We think about personal information in the sense of sensitive attributes, right? So there's all sorts of laws that say, I can go and record information about you. That's all quite benign, but personal information, like, things like your age, sex, and so on, these are a lot more protected. And the surprising thing is, and I think this is a very worthwhile paper to go and look at, is that you can actually predict a huge amount of information about people on the basis of very limited data. Just what things that you like on a website or just your click stream. So this second paper, they looked at there's this thing called the Big Five Personality Inventory. So it's a kind of a consensus view of psychologists that it's a way of mapping the different types of personality, introvert, extrovert, openness to new experience, right? There's 5 of them. And essentially, if I know where you are in that 5-dimensional space, I actually know a lot about you. I know the kind of character that you are. You can very reliably determine that just by looking at the sequence of websites that you look at. That's all that you need, right? So they built this model, and it's astonishing how well it works. So that was done 11 years ago. And the point is, these things can work when you've got a stupendous amount of data. So I think this study here by Tora Grappel and others, they were at that time, they were at Microsoft, and I think then Microsoft had like 30 or 40% of the worldwide browser market. So people still used Internet Explorer. There was this law case where they had to be given the option to install a different browser, but the default was Internet Explorer. And of course, most people left the default. So Microsoft had the click streams of 30% of the internet users on the planet. And from that trove of data, you could go and work out an incredible amount about people. So, and there's this nice paper by these two ladies, Karina Vold and Jess Whittleston. So this was the paper that, when I read it a couple of years ago, kind of opened my eyes to a completely different way of looking at this. So they're in particular the ones that drew the distinction between persuasion and manipulation. Anyway, so that's also on my recommended reading, and it's relatively short and easy to read. This problem, if you take that as a thing that you're interested in solving, there's some other interesting literatures that touch on similar things. So there's a thing called neuromarketing. So it's a bit like the example I gave before about what's the best time to try and sell makeup to women. The idea is that, you just study scientifically the way our brains work and what they pay attention to, and then you use that to improve your targeting. And it's kind of interesting to see the way the proponents of this think about their problem. And this is directly related to the point I made before about the Russell Harden paper, Ethics and Stochastic Processes. So think of the distinction between a deterministic influence and a probabilistic one, right? So with a deterministic influence, I can be sure I can interfere with you. If I just have it statistically that I'm interfering with only 80% of you, right, I can say, honestly, I may not have interfered with you. This is a true statement. this is kind of what these folks are saying here, right? You know, if you're feeling queasy about doing all of this sneaky stuff to manipulate people, it's fine because it's probabilistic, right? Neuromarketing farms, they don't need to claim that consumers' behavior is completely determined. Rather, they can admit that consumers, they're free to stop themselves from buying the products. All the neuromarketing firms need to claim is that consumers are more likely to buy certain products in some circumstances than in other. You know, what's wrong with that, right? I mean, it's a very ingenuous kind of argument, but my point is that the core of this is the distinction between achieving something deterministically and achieving something statistically. Achieving it statistically, as long as the statistics are good enough, you can make billions of dollars, right? It works, right? That's the interesting thing about advertising. There's repeat custom, right? So people wouldn't keep spending money on these platforms if it didn't work. And working means that you've achieved the goal of changing people's minds. So anyway, okay, I don't need to say that. So we get, you know, at bottom to try and theorize about this. I think there is this intriguing question then about what is the relationship between a probability distribution and an individual. Because that's just another way of stating this question. Here you all are as individuals. I can respect you as individuals. It's as individuals that you suffer harm. From the perspective of a machine learning algorithm, you're just a distribution. I'm messing with the distribution. How do we connect those two viewpoints of thinking about, oh, I'm only interfering with the distribution, but actually the harms or benefits accrue to the individuals? We'll grapple with that in subsequent lectures. So there's some other literature that you might want to go and look at. I don't think I'll say anything about that. You can read that. And some more pointers that I've just given in case this is particularly interesting to you. The folks behind the Ad Nauseam browser plugin actually made this whole book on obfuscation, but in the earlier slides I pointed you to a short paper. This just kind of elaborates it, but I think it's kind of cool. Okay, so what, right? What do I conclude from that? I think this is it's an interestingly different problem to think about that is mediated by machine learning. But I want to stress it's not a new problem. So here is Seneca the Younger writing, I guess, over 2,000 years ago. Our stupidity may be clearly proved by the fact that we hold that buying refers only to the objects for which we pay cash, and we regard as free gifts the things for which we spend our very selves. We are eager to attain them at the cost of anxiety, of danger, of loss on our personal freedom and time. So true is it that each man regards nothing as cheaper than himself. He's talking about the internet economy, right? The companies offer you all of this free stuff, and the only thing that you pay is your very self. No money. That's my interpretation. I know it's a little bit of a stretch, but a more general point I want to make is that the harms here that we've been talking about, they do not arise from the data, but what is done with it. And we'll come back to this point later on, right? So just as a foretaste, just think of, suppose you look at this and you think, we need to do something about it, right? We're not happy with this situation. It's AI that's making this bad. Therefore, the logic goes, we need to regulate AI as a technology. Now, AI as a technology isn't the issue here. It's what people are doing with it. I'll make this point many times later on. Just think of the analogy of the technology of steel. I can use steel to make a gun or a knife to harm you, or I can make a baby's pram, right? So figuring out what is being done is matters for all technologies. So I think you can reasonably thus conclude that searching for ways of making the data private or fair in itself will fail, or maybe more precisely, will be irrelevant. Remember my cartoon caricature of manipulation as a service? I stressed that all of the data is perfectly secret. No private information leaks, right? That's not the issue. The issue is what is done with it. And it's still an information-based harm, which can be mitigated by information theoretic methods. But these harms, you can't see them if you just look at the data. You have to look at the whole system, right? I stressed that it was that feedback loop. That's a system that is the problem. And the technical means for mitigating that include various information throttles. Differential privacy destroys information, it protects privacy as secrecy. Statistical independence, ensuring that through your algorithm or your mechanism, that's a way you can think of that information theoretically. That achieves fairness. And obfuscation, I gave you some examples of that, can protect your autonomy. But they're all interesting. They're all information theoretic. So just one last thing to finish up, only take a couple of minutes, which I want you to go and learn on your own. I'm just going to point you to it, which I'm just characterizing as a subtlety of conditional probability. So to motivate it, this is a classic example from data. This was student admission data at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, some time ago, like 20 years or more ago. And people looked at the total number of applicants to get into the university. So it's a selective entry, right? So just because you want to go doesn't mean you get to go. So there's this process where people get to choose. So they looked at these numbers, number of applicants in total, fraction admitted, 41%. Men, 44% of men were admitted, only 35% of women were admitted. Now, if I just gave you those statistics and we thought about this as a fairness problem, what would you conclude?
Bias towards men.
Yeah, sure looks it, right? Looks pretty sus, doesn't it, right? But the folks there weren't trying to do that, or so they said. Anyway, you dig deeper, and what they broke it down by department. So their aggregate figures, here are the departmental figures, right? So look at this line by line, and you go and look at the ratios, and I don't know if you can see that number's in bold, 82%, 62%. For this department, more women than men. For this department, more men than women. This one, more women than men. This one, more women than men, right? So what's going on here? So the story they figured out in the end was that, yes, it's true, more men were admitted than women, but it turns out more women than men applied for the programs that were more difficult to get into. That's the story, all right? Now, if we abstract this, so let's not get hung up on, our job is not to be university admissions people, let's abstract mathematically what's going on. And there's this lovely animation, so this is from the Wikipedia page. I like this because it explains this slightly subtle idea purely graphically, right? So let's suppose we had data like this, right? This might be, I don't know, something like some feature that we measure about you, and then that's the outcome that you get. And if you had data like this, right, you could eyeball that and fit a regression line like this, right? But if we condition, if it turns out that actually we use some extra attribute, this might be interest or sex or God knows what, right? And if we then go and conditioned on it being red, we wait for it, I then go and fit the regression line, it goes the other way. So the point is, if you just asked in words, right, does increasing X lead to decreasing Y? Just abstractly, you'd say, yeah, in general that's true. But if we go and look at the 5 separate groups of people that we've got and we say, oh, okay, so we know that at the population level, if I increase X, Y goes down. Great. We'll go and apply that to the red people. You'll be wrong. We'll go and apply it to the yellow people. You'll be wrong. The green people, you'll be wrong. You'll be wrong on every single group. Right? This is the interesting thing. So it's called a paradox, right? But it's not really a paradox. It's just, I think of it as a subtlety. A Simpson's subtlety. Doesn't sound as good as Simpson's paradox. Anyway, that's what it's called, Simpson's paradox. This is stolen from the Wikipedia page. And I've got references in the readings that talk about the Berkeley study, and a couple about, the ubiquity of Simpson's paradox in real life. You need to know this, right? It's so easy to kind of shoot yourself in the foot with statistics if you don't know this, right? Let me be clear. I'm not saying that just because the Berkeley case of Simpson's was a manifestation of this, that everything was fine and good at Berkeley, right? It's a way of looking at it, and it's a generic phenomenon that can occur very, very widely, that depending upon what you condition upon, the lesson that you thought you knew at the population level doesn't necessarily hold once you condition, right? And you just memorize this animation, you can kind of see it. So that's it for today. So what have we done today? We looked at Dwork's individual fairness, which looks directly at the individual features and tries to implement the ethical principle of treat like people alike. And we looked at the relationship to the group-based methods. I argued that privacy is another information-based harm, and differential privacy is one way of mitigating that. Well, privacy is secrecy in particular, and differential privacy, intriguingly, is formulated itself as a statistical learning problem. And then I said, well, there's actually this other whole class of information-based harms, privacy as autonomy, that are, I think, actually far more pervasive, arguably more harmful, but studied far less. And there was this common pattern that the technical mitigations that you've got against all these information-based harms come down to destroying information, which is kind of interesting. We also saw that for at least our more thorny problems, you can't just look at the maths. We start with the societal problem, we can make some progress in the maths, but the manipulation as a service business model, you can't avoid thinking of the broader socio-technical system. And the final thing was, how Simpson's paradox illustrates the subtlety of conditional probability.